Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and it is time for the Week 10 wide receiver rankings. We're going to go through about 30-something. I don't think we're going to quite get all the way through 36 even. Wide receivers, it's not like the best of wide receiver weeks. There's a tier. I think like the third tier is just all guys in really tough matchups, or essentially that. And then after I get through about the 34 or so wide receivers that I show you on here, I really think we enter into a group of question marks. And I will show you who I'm not ranking currently. Some of those guys might end up playing, so that will, of course, change things. You can find these rankings up on the website, www.theFFForge.com. We're going to be going through my rankings. You can see on the screen. I also have projections. There's a low end and a high end to the projections, an expected range. And if you don't really care about that and all you want to see is the rankings, there's this little tab up on the website as well that you can click. That will get you those rankings. Let's get through the first tier. These are the must-start wide receivers. I don't think there's a whole lot to say about many of these. We are going to talk about one of them. You're going to be at the very end of this at my wide receiver 11, and that's going to be Terry McLaurin. But this tier starts off at my wide receiver 1 with Justin Jefferson going up against Jacksonville. Great matchup. Of course, he's the wide receiver 1 this week, followed by Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Malik Neighbors, Garrett Wilson, Amon-Ra St. Brown. We've got Tyreek Hill, and then we have another guy who we are actually going to be talking about in this first tier in Devonta Smith, Puka Nacua, CeeDee Lamb, and then, like I said, Terry McLaurin there at wide receiver 11. So beginning off with my first love of the week, Devonta Smith. He's possibly going to be without A.J. Brown this week, and if that is the case, that's why I have him in this must-start territory. Going to be going up against Dallas this week. Not exactly the world's toughest matchup. Provides some upside. A team that's kind of, things aren't looking great for Dallas, and that's where my upside here gets a little bit limited because they might just be able to run the ball a whole lot against Dallas, but I've thought that in other weeks, and it hasn't totally come true. So, once again, without A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, much more targeted. He's received 8.7 targets per game, and that includes one, partial game last week where A.J. Brown went out. Otherwise, 2 of the 3 games that I counted for that, he had 10 targets within. So we can anticipate somewhere around 9 targets at least for Devonta Smith in this matchup. And with A.J. Brown, just to give you a comparison, that's 5.3 targets a game. So a bit of a difference in his usage, and I like the higher usage, of course, for Devonta Smith. And then Terry McLaurin, just wanted to touch base on him. I could have put a fade tag on this going up against Pittsburgh. It's not a great matchup against Pittsburgh, but McLaurin has been too good to be sitting. That's why he just makes it into this must-start tier for me. He is my wide receiver 13 on the season right now, so essentially a wide receiver 1 on a per-game basis. How do you sit that? It's really, really tough in my opinion. But hey, if you want to, this would, maybe be one of the weeks to do that. Now, we did see one of my loves. There's going to be 2 more loves. 3 fades in this video, and I always like to recap how I did in my previous week's video with my loves and my fades. So last week I had Chris Olave, so that does not count as one of my loves. I had Courtland Sutton as a love. He finished as the wide receiver 7, so that's great coming off. I think it was like a fade the week before for him, maybe, that I would have gotten right for him. So we've been figuring out Courtland Sutton as of late. But disappointingly, I also had Michael Pittman Jr. on that list, and that Indianapolis offense struggled a lot more than I anticipated. Did not have a good week. For my fades, I did fade the Baltimore wide receivers. Essentially, at the end of the day, for Zay Jones, just got a little bit too concerned about things, apparently. I don't know how they got him away from Patrick Surtain as much as they did, but they did, and he had a good week, a very, very, very good week, especially when you consider that I faded him. And then Tank Dell was another fade of mine, but what I will say here, obviously he had a good week as well, wide receiver 14. I did have him ranked higher than the experts, so Zay Flowers too. I didn't have these guys exactly ranked extremely low. I was concerned about them, though, in these games, in these matchups this week. And then for Marvin Harrison, I suspected that he would get 5 targets at most in this game. I said 4 to 5. And in a rough matchup, that would lead to about 2 or 3 receptions at the most. And that's exactly what happened. He got 2 of his 5 targets, which is obviously tough to make a good game out of, and he did not. So that fade worked out well. Let's continue to move on with these wide receiver rankings. And while I get this next tier up and going, I just want to thank all of the members of the channel. You guys absolutely rock, and I'm hoping to have an announcement in regards to membership, my Discord, etc. within like the next 2 weeks. Kind of a busy week this week and next week, where I'm trying to think of making a couple of changes just to make things a little bit simpler. It's really an announcement for everybody at the end of the day, so just keep an eye out for that. Now, you can see I got my next 2 loves here in this next tier, going from wide receivers 12 through 19. Kicks off at wide receiver 12 with Darnell Mooney, followed by Davante Adams, Zay Flowers, Deebo Samuel, Brian Thomas Jr., George Pickens, Tank Dell, and Juwan Jennings is my wide receiver 19. The highlights are just really there to remind me that I have notes on those players to speak on. As far as Darnell Mooney, he's going to be my second love of the week here at my wide receiver 12, which puts him darn close there to must-start territory. And we think of Darnell Mooney as being boom or bust, I don't know. We don't always have the best opinions of Darnell Mooney in general, especially like the media doesn't always talk about him a lot and the best, and I think undersells how good of a season that he's been having. He's been averaging 7.6 targets a game so far in this season. That's the 14th most among wide receivers that I have projected this week specifically, and probably actually a little bit higher if some of the people who I am not projecting, which I'll cover towards the end of the video, are out. So at the higher end of target share or pure targets out of the wide receivers that we have available to us this week, via my EV system, he's a wide receiver 19 on the season. That's just like average fantasy points per week, but it takes consistency into account, and I do eliminate games where guys get injured in like the first quarter on that list as well, so that doesn't count against them. Just because I like that list to also be a slight predictor of the future for full game success. And then you look at the opponent here going up against New Orleans for Darnell Mooney, and they've been absolutely horrendous on defense for several weeks now. And with no Drake London, I think that we know, even as a fact, that Darnell Mooney can step up, can be successful as a wide receiver 1 to some extent at least, and I expect that to be able to happen in this kind of matchup. Then we got Davante Adams here, who I think we saw a bit of a coming out party begin to occur between him and Aaron Rodgers, especially as I recall it towards the second half of the game that was the Thursday night game, right? So that's exciting for any Davante Adams owners. Adams had a couple of plays that he usually makes that just literally one of them slips through his fingers. The other one he just like knocked down for some reason. Typically not things that happen to Adams. He's got pretty solid hands, or he has for a long time now. Early on in his career was a bit of an issue. And all in all, I think that things will looking good, will look good going forward here. And that begins this week going up against Arizona. It's an awfully nice matchup. So I'm excited about Davante Adams, and that should show with that ranking. Brian Thomas Jr., my last love of the week here, my wide receiver 16 on the week, going up against the Minnesota Vikings. And you darn tootin' that matchup is a part of the reason that I love them. That's the second best matchup for wide receivers on the season based on average fantasy points given up in half PPR scoring on an average weekly basis. Brian Thomas is going to be 1 week healthier from an injury that threatened to keep him off of the field last week, but he played through it. More of a pain tolerance thing, I believe, than anything, but, could have limited him to some extent. So I'm expecting a bounce back for him in this really good matchup. I would have a tough time sitting Brian Thomas Jr. unless I'm absolutely loaded at wide receiver. Then we've got Tank Dell, Juwan Jennings in terms of Tank Dell here, my wide receiver 18 on the week. Originally was a love for me. Then I was looking at Brian Thomas Jr. a little bit closer. I had him ranked higher, and I looked at their start percentages on ESPN, and Tank Dell started about 50% of leagues right now, whereas Brian Thomas Jr. only like 30%. So I switched my love over to Brian Thomas Jr., but Tank Dell, similar situation here in terms of the matchup. Third best matchup against Detroit for them this week. And if there's no Nico Collins, obviously that's especially a good reason to like and play Tank Dell and take a shot on him. Even if even if Nico Collins comes back because of the matchup, still going to be pretty excited about him. I think that he'll probably be at the top of, not this next tier, but the tier after that, with a couple of guys like, I think it's like Jordan Addison and somebody else. I'll try to remember to point out exactly where I would end up having him ranked if Nico Collins does come back, I think. Then Jauan Jennings, San Francisco, going to be highlighted in a new role with Brandon Ayuk, out now, going up against Tampa Bay. I always like targeting Tampa Bay for wide receivers. It always seems to work out quite nicely, and I expect that to continue. As we saw earlier this year, when asked to step up into a bigger role, Jauan Jennings did do that. He's proven that he can do that, so I'm not too concerned about if he can have a big week against Tampa Bay. It's just, will he, really? And there's some competition there, but I'm pretty excited. Jauan Jennings, am I a little too high on him right now? Possibly throughout the week. I might end up lowering him into the mid-20s or something like that, but I expect to be, as high as you get on him. I'm pretty excited about putting him into my lineup if I'm not, once again, loaded at wide receiver. Let's move on to this next tier of wide receivers, and here's where I kind of introduced this tier already. The tier of bad matchups. It starts off with Josh Downs at my wide receiver 20, followed by Khalil Shakir, Ladd McConkey, DJ Moore, Cortland Sutton, Calvin Ridley, Marvin Harrison Jr., DeAndre Hopkins. So you can see, I think, some patterns in this tier. These aren't guys that we can fully trust on a week in and week out basis. And on top of that, a lot of them here are in some of the tougher wide receiver matchups. In terms of Josh Downs, my wide receiver 20, it was a down week for him last week in terms of production. However, he did still get targeted 9 times, and he averages over 8 targets a game on the season. I think that he's definitely still worth trotting out there with those kinds of opportunity numbers. And you can see it in the projections. The projections look pretty nice there for Josh Downs, but it is a tougher matchup against Buffalo that concerns me with how things worked out last week. Then we've got Khalil Shakir going up against Indianapolis. That's one of the ones where it's not the toughest matchup. Would like to see him do a little bit more last week with some expanded opportunity there. It didn't come through. Will it come through this week? I don't know for sure, but it's a nice matchup for it to possibly come through. Then we've got the first of my 3 fades, and they're all in this tier because, yes, these are some tough matchups going up against Tennessee for Ladd McConkey. That is a tough matchup. In fact, it's the 4th worst wide receiver matchup via average fantasy points given up on a weekly basis. He's not been heavily targeted on the season for one reason or another, and we saw Quentin Johnston came back last week, and as I expected, that did eat into his target share by a little ways, and QJ didn't give him any reason not to target him going forward, so I still like Ladd quite a bit, but in a tougher matchup here, I am concerned about how good of a game he ends up having. DJ Moore, New England, not the worst matchup in the world, but tough to trust. Cortland Sutton, really tough matchup against Kansas City. Calvin Ridley, really, really tough matchup against Los Angeles Chargers. Marvin Harrison Jr., really, really, really tough matchup against the New York Jets. It's the 2nd worst wide receiver matchup that there is. He's the wide receiver 35 on the season via my equalized value rankings, and he has been the 31st most targeted among wide receivers who I have projected this week. So, not great numbers when you're trying to project forward for success in a really, really tough matchup. Once again, I didn't even realize that I had faded him last week, but I'm once again concerned about Marvin Harrison and all in all this passing game for Arizona in a game where they'll probably be able to and will want to establish the run against New York Jets. The silver lining is as that Jets offense gets a little bit better, maybe that'll put that defense into some situations where they'll have to play a little bit looser, give up some more yards. Teams will have to pass against them a little bit more. Might knock them off from that 2nd worst wide receiver matchup as for the rest of the season. And then last up, we have DeAndre Hopkins going up against Denver. Quite likely, I don't think you can get DeAndre Hopkins away from Patrick Surtain. I was a little bit concerned if they would even bother, taking Zay Flowers specifically out, shadowing Zay Flowers with Patrick Surtain. Appears that they didn't do that last week. I think that you would see in any situation here, DeAndre Hopkins will get shadowed by Patrick Surtain. I don't expect that to be Good for his production this week, and especially if Juju Smith returns, that's just going to give all the more reason for Patrick Mahomes to say, I'm not going to give Patrick Surtain the opportunity here and just avoid that. Use DeAndre as a bit of a ploy to open things up for the rest of the guys in this offense, rather than as somebody who you're targeting too often, and when you do, will it be a successful target? Yeah, questionable. It's a tough matchup there. That's going to bring us on to this second to last little tier here. Wide receivers 28 through 30. Jameson Williams, Jordan Addison, and Jalen Waddle. Good matchups for guys who are boom or bust is the best way to explain them. And Jalen Waddle really hasn't had the boom happen to him yet this year. But, you know, we still hope. But it's rough. And then our final tier from wide receiver 31 through 34. We got Xavier Worthy, play him on a hope and a prayer, going up against Denver, but he is not the guy who I would expect Patrick Surtain to be covering too often. So, last week the foot was out of bounds. This week it could be in bounds. Michael Pittman Jr. going up against Buffalo. He didn't come through last week. It's a really tough wide receiver matchup, so he could be higher, but he's not. Rome Odunze did come through last week for the first time all year, really, or maybe second time. New England, a tougher matchup, not the toughest matchup in the world, and he's not going to see the number one there, so I actually kind of like Rome Odunze this week, and I guess a 33rd ranking for him, given what he's done on the season, would back up the fact that you kind of like him this week. And Xavier Legette kind of like too, going up against New York Giants. Not the best matchup, not the worst matchup, but he's the guy who should see the most targets most weeks in this offense, and we'll still give that a little bit of faith. But, hopefully you just don't have to play Xavier Legette. Hopefully you've just got better guys on your roster that you can play. And, that's how I'm feeling at wide receiver 34. It gives you an idea for the next 30 wide receivers, how we feel about them. There's obviously gems out there. There's guys who will produce, and there's still some guys who might be able to come back and help produce for these teams this week. We got Nico Collins going up against Detroit. Sure would be nice to get him back for that matchup. A.J. Brown going up against Dallas. Sure would be nice to get him back. T. Higgins, I know he did not practice today on Tuesday, going up against Baltimore. Would be nice to have him back. Drake London going up against New Orleans. Would be nice to have him back. Don't know that'll happen, but it's definitely not out of the question. He is questionable day to day right now. Mike Evans. I mean, it would always be nice to have Mike Evans back, right? Amari Cooper going up against Indianapolis. Keon Coleman going up against Indianapolis. Good matchup for some guys who've had some varying success there as of late. And then Juju Smith-Schuster against Denver, once again, I think would be the safety valve in this matchup. I will update these projections as these guys, if they get put into the lineups, that will change some of the projections for them and other guys on their teams. And then Jalen McMillan, also anticipating him to miss with that fresh hamstring injury off of last week's Friday practice, I think. So there you go. There's the wide receivers. Running backs will come out later today. Quarterbacks, tight ends come out tomorrow morning. And I'll be available Tuesday for any of your start-sit questions. I will be available Saturday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for any of your start-sit questions, trade questions, etc. And Sunday morning, same thing, 2.5 hours prior to kickoff. Again, started going a little bit earlier on Sundays. So thank you very much. And an extra special, important thank you to members of this channel. You're the best. And peace out. I'll see you soon.